I needed a break, a real one. City life had been pressing in on me for months, and I couldn't take the noise, the crowds, or the constant weight of work any longer. A cabin in the woods sounded like the perfect escape. Just me, a week of fresh air, and nothing but the sounds of nature to keep me company. I found the rental online. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple one-room cabin tucked deep into the forest, about 15 miles from the nearest town. The pictures showed a weathered wooden structure with a covered porch, an old fire pit out front, and a long gravel driveway disappearing into the trees. No neighbors, no Wi-Fi, and barely any cell reception. Exactly what I needed. The drive up took longer than expected. The road turned from pavement to dirt, then to something that barely qualified as a road at all. Overgrown branches scraped against my truck as I crawled along the last few miles. The directions said to look for a wooden sign nailed to a tree that read broken pine, and sure enough, I found it. Weathered and nearly unreadable, half swallowed by the bark. The cabin sat at the end of the path, just like the photos. It looked even older in person, the wood darkened from years of exposure, the roof sagging slightly in the middle. A rusty old axe was buried in a tree stump out front, and a stack of firewood sat beside the porch. The place had been used recently enough. I killed the engine and sat for a moment, letting the silence settle around me. No traffic, no sirens, no voices. Just wind through the trees and the occasional creak of wood shifting in the breeze. I grabbed my bag and headed inside. The key was under a loose board on the porch, just as the owner had told me in the email. The door stuck a little when I pushed it open, and the inside smelled like dust and pine. It was simple. A single room with a small kitchen, a wood stove, and a bed pushed against the far wall. The windows were small, their glass old and slightly warped. There was a door in the back that led to a small bathroom, just a toilet and sink with an outdoor shower set up beyond that. I set my bag down on the bed and checked my phone. 1 bar. Enough to send a text if I needed to, but not enough for anything else. The first night was uneventful. I made a fire, cooked a quick meal, and sat outside listening to the woods settle into night. I had expected to feel uneasy, being alone out here, but instead, I felt calm. The kind of calm I hadn't felt in months. It was around midnight when I heard the first noise. A single, heavy thud against the side of the cabin. I sat up in bed, heart hammering. It wasn't the kind of sound trees made in the wind. It was solid, deliberate. I waited, listening, but heard nothing else. Probably an animal, I told myself. A deer brushing against the wall. A raccoon knocking something over. Still, I grabbed the flashlight and stepped onto the porch, shining the beam around the clearing. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the ground. The trees stood silent and unmoving. Nothing. I told myself I was being paranoid and went back inside. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach tighten. Near the edge of the trees, about 20 feet from the cabin, the dirt had been disturbed. A wide, uneven patch of earth looked like it had been scraped or dragged. No tracks, no obvious sign of what had done it. Just the strange, disrupted ground. I tried not to dwell on it. The second night, the noise came again. This time, it wasn't a single thud. It was a slow, deliberate scraping, like something rough dragging against the wood. I sat up in bed, every muscle locked in place. It moved from the far wall toward the front of the cabin, the sound steady, unhurried. I reached for the flashlight, but my hands were shaking. The sound stopped. I waited, barely breathing. Then came the footsteps. Not heavy, not fast, just soft, careful steps moving across the porch. I wanted to call out, but my throat was dry. The steps reached the door. Silence. Then the doorknob twisted. I shot out of bed, heart hammering against my ribs. I grabbed the heavy flashlight and stepped toward the door as quietly as I could. The knob jiggled again, harder this time. I held my breath, waiting for the door to swing open. For something, someone to step inside. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. No footsteps retreating, no sound at all. I stayed awake until dawn, listening to the silence, my back pressed against the wall, the flashlight gripped tight in my hand. When morning came, I forced myself to go outside. The clearing was empty. The trees stood still. But on the porch, right in front of the door, was a single boot print. Not mine. I packed my things. I didn't care if I had paid for a full week. I wasn't staying another night. I threw my bag into the truck and turned the key. The engine didn't start. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood, pretending I knew what I was looking at. Everything looked fine, but I wasn't a mechanic. A mile back down the road, I remembered passing a small hunting cabin. Maybe someone was there. Maybe they had a phone. I grabbed my bag, locked the truck, and started walking. The woods were silent, unnaturally so. No birds, no wind, just my own footsteps crunching on the gravel. Then I saw them, boot prints, leading from the cabin. And they weren't mine. They were fresh. They followed the road for a few yards, then disappeared into the trees. I walked faster. The hunting cabin was abandoned. A rusted-out truck sat in the clearing, its windows shattered. The door hung open, revealing a collapsed cot and broken furniture inside. No phone. I had two choices: go back to my cabin and wait, or keep walking and hope I reach town before dark. I chose to walk. I made it back just before sundown, legs aching, throat raw. The guy at the gas station barely looked up when I stumbled inside, asking for a tow. It took hours for the truck to arrive, and when I finally got back to the cabin, I stayed in the driver's seat, eyes scanning the trees. The tow driver popped the hood, fiddled with something, and my truck started right up. Said it was fine, but it wasn't fine last night. I didn't tell him what happened. I just got in the truck and left. As I turned onto the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing at the tree line, half hidden by the shadows. Watching. I never looked back. It started as a last-minute decision. I needed a break, a chance to clear my head. So when I found a cheap rental cabin deep in the woods, I didn't think twice. The listing described it as rustic but comfortable, isolated enough to offer peace and quiet. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive out was long. The last hour was spent on winding dirt roads, the kind where dust kicks up behind your car and the trees press in close. There were no houses, no signs of life, just the occasional deer darting into the brush. My phone lost signal long before I reached the cabin. When I finally pulled up, the place looked exactly like the pictures. A small wooden structure with a slanted roof, an old chimney, and a porch that sagged slightly in the middle. It was nestled between tall pines, with a narrow path leading down to a nearby lake. The sun was already dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows over the clearing. The key was under a loose brick on the porch, just as the owner had said in his last email. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood and dust. The furniture was old but sturdy. Just a couch, a wooden table, and a single bed pushed against the wall. A fireplace stood cold and empty in the corner. There was no electricity, just a few battery-powered lanterns and a propane stove in the tiny kitchen. I unpacked quickly, setting my bag on the bed and lighting a lantern as the last of the daylight faded. The quiet was absolute. No cars, no voices, not even the hum of distant traffic. Just the wind in the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I told myself I'd enjoy the silence. I made a simple dinner, canned soup and crackers, then sat outside on the porch, staring up at the stars. It was colder than I expected. I could see my breath in the air. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. I told myself I'd sleep early, maybe wake up with the sun, go for a hike, but something about the place felt off. Not wrong exactly, just off. Maybe it was the way the trees moved in the wind, bending and shifting like they were whispering to each other. Maybe it was the darkness, thicker than I was used to, swallowing the trees completely past a certain point. I kept glancing toward the lake, barely visible in the moonlight, a still, black mirror stretching out between the trees. Eventually, I forced myself inside, locking the door behind me. I shut off the lantern, climbed into bed, and pulled the blankets tight around my shoulders. The mattress was thin, the sheets rough, but I was exhausted. I closed my eyes. I must have slept for a few hours. Then I woke up. Something had woken me, but I didn't know what. I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, listening. The wind had died down. The woods were completely still. Then, a creak. Not loud, not sudden. Just a slow, gentle creak of wood. I held my breath. It sounded like it had come from the porch. I told myself it was nothing. Just the cabin settling, maybe the wind shifting the boards. I turned over, pulling the blanket higher. But then, another creak. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing myself to stay still. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal, maybe a raccoon? But then why was the sound so slow, so deliberate? Silence stretched on. I waited, counting seconds in my head. Nothing. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, everything felt normal. The sunlight filtered through the trees, golden and soft, and the fear from the night before seemed stupid. Of course, the cabin made noises. It was old, with shifts. I made coffee on the propane stove, then decided to check out the lake. The trail leading down was narrow, overgrown in some places, but well-trodden. The water was still and clear, reflecting the trees perfectly. There was a small dock, half-rotted, jutting out into the water. That's when I saw them. Footprints. They led from the trees at the edge of the clearing, down to the dock, then stopped. Just stopped, right at the edge of the dock, like someone had walked straight into the water. I stared at them for a long time. The prints were fresh. I told myself they could have been mine. Maybe I had walked there the night before and forgotten. But my boots didn't match. These were larger, barefoot. A strange unease crept up my spine. I forced myself to shake it off. Maybe the owner came by recently. Maybe a hiker passed through. Still, I didn't stay long. That night, I double-checked the lock on the door. I kept the lantern on. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting. For a while, nothing happened. Then, deep in the middle of the night, a sound. Not a creak this time. Something softer, closer, breathing. I sat up, heart hammering. The sound was faint, but it was there. Slow, steady breathing, just beyond the walls of the cabin. I reached for the lantern, hand shaking. My mind scrambled for a rational explanation. An animal, the wind, something normal. But deep down, I knew. Someone was standing outside. I sat frozen, listening. The breathing didn't stop. It was close, right outside the window, steady and unhurried. Then, a slow scrape, like fingertips trailing along the wooden wall. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself not to move. The sound slid along the length of the cabin, pausing near the door. Then silence. I sat there, gripping the blankets, heart pounding against my ribs. I stayed like that for hours, waiting, barely breathing. When morning finally came, I found nothing outside. No footprints, no signs of anyone. But I wasn't imagining it. I packed my bag. I didn't stay for the third night. I didn't even eat breakfast. I locked the cabin behind me, climbed into my car, and started driving. The road back felt longer, like the woods were stretching, trying to keep me there. I gripped the wheel, refusing to look in the rearview mirror. When I finally reached the main road, I pulled over, catching my breath. My phone had signal again. I opened the listing, ready to leave a review, a warning for anyone else who might stay there. But the page was gone. No listing, no cabin, like it had never existed. I stared at my screen, blood turning cold. Then, slowly, I put the car back in drive and left without looking back. The drive to the cabin felt longer than it should have. The last 2 hours had been on a winding gravel road, dust kicking up behind my truck, the trees pressing in on both sides. I hadn't seen another vehicle since I turned off the main highway, just miles of thick forest stretching out in every direction. The late afternoon light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows over the road. I was supposed to meet my friend Eric out here, but he was running late. I had booked the place for a long weekend, just a simple one-room cabin deep in the woods. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just quiet. It was supposed to be relaxing, a break from everything. I told myself I needed it. Work had been getting to me, and I felt like I was running on fumes. Some time alone, hiking, fishing, maybe just sitting on the porch with a beer, seemed like exactly what I needed. The directions the owner had given me were clear. Take the gravel road past mile marker 27, turn left at the rusted mailbox, then follow the dirt path until I saw the cabin. When I finally spotted it, tucked back against a wall of tall pines, I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. It looked exactly like the pictures. A small, sturdy-looking wooden cabin with a tin roof, a narrow porch with a couple of chairs, and a stone fire pit a few yards away. I pulled into the clearing, shut off the engine, and stepped out. The silence hit me immediately. No traffic, no distant hum of a city, just the faint rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of birds. It was unsettling at first, but I told myself I'd get used to it. I grabbed my bag and the cooler from the truck, hauled them inside, and set everything down. The inside of the cabin was simple, just a single room with a wood-burning stove, a bed pushed against the back wall, a small kitchenette, and a tiny bathroom off to the side. There was a stack of firewood beside the stove, and a couple of old hunting magazines on a wooden table near the window. It smelled like wood and dust, like no one had been here for a while. I checked my phone, no service. Not surprising. Eric had mentioned he might not make it until tomorrow, depending on how long work kept him. That meant I'd have the night to myself. I stepped back outside to grab more supplies, and that's when I noticed it. Footprints. Not mine. They were faint, just barely visible in the dirt near the fire pit. But they were there, fresh enough that they hadn't been washed away by rain. I frowned, looking around. Maybe the owner had been out here recently? Maybe a hunter? The cabin was supposed to be pretty remote, though. I hadn't passed any other properties for miles. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. Still, I felt uneasy. The sun was already sinking low, the sky turning a dull orange through the trees. I decided to get a fire going before it got too dark. The fire pit was well built, lined with stones, and had a pile of half-burnt logs inside. I gathered some dry branches and got to work. By the time the fire was crackling, the sky was nearly black. I set up a folding chair, grabbed a beer from the cooler, and sat down. The flames cast flickering light across the clearing, sending long, shifting shadows into the trees. The sound of the fire was the only thing keeping the silence from swallowing everything. I tried to relax, but something felt off. The woods felt too quiet. I listened, waiting for the usual sounds of night, crickets, distant hoots of owls, maybe the rustling of some small animal moving through the brush. But there was nothing, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional pop of burning wood. I scanned the tree line. I couldn't see anything past the reach of the firelight, but I felt watched. That prickling sensation at the back of my neck, the kind you get when someone is staring at you. I told myself I was being paranoid. I finished my beer, put out the fire, and went inside. The cabin felt safer. I locked the door, checked the windows, then turned on the small lantern by the bed. The quiet inside was different, less eerie, more comfortable. I crawled into bed, listening to the faint creaks of the wooden walls settling. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the ceiling. Sleep didn't come easy. Then I heard it, a single, deliberate footstep outside. My breath caught. It wasn't the sound of an animal. Too heavy, too deliberate. I lay frozen, ears straining in the silence. Then another step, and another, slow, measured, right outside the cabin. I wanted to believe it was Eric. Maybe he'd shown up after all. Maybe he was messing with me, but something about the way those footsteps moved didn't feel right. I reached for my flashlight, turned it on, and aimed it at the window. The light reflected off the glass, showing nothing but trees. No movement, no shapes. I held my breath, waiting. Silence. Had I imagined it? After what felt like an eternity, I convinced myself I had. Maybe it had been a branch falling or the cabin shifting. I turned off the flashlight and forced myself to close my eyes. Eventually, I drifted off. The next morning, The unease from the night before hadn't fully faded. I stepped outside, stretching in the cool morning air. The clearing looked the same, nothing out of place. Then I saw the footprints, clearer this time. They led from the tree line to the porch, and back again. Someone had been outside last night, watching. I felt my stomach tighten. I scanned the trees, but there was nothing out of place. The forest was still. I didn't want to panic. Maybe it was just a lost hiker. Maybe they saw the cabin, got curious, and left. I forced myself to go about my day. I went for a hike, tried to enjoy the scenery. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but the feeling never left. By the time the sun started setting, I couldn't shake the unease. I didn't want to spend another night alone. Eric still hadn't shown up. I made up my mind. I packed my bag, loaded up my truck, and started the engine. As I backed up, my headlights swept across the tree line, and that's when I saw him, a man, standing just inside the trees, tall, motionless, watching. He didn't move. He didn't react to the headlights. I didn't wait to see what he would do. I threw the truck into drive and tore down the dirt road, gravel spraying behind me. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I didn't sleep that night, even after I got home. Eric called the next morning. He'd been stuck at work and hadn't made it out. I told him not to bother. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know if I was paranoid, unlucky, or just in the wrong place at the wrong time. I had rented a small cabin deep in the woods, about a 30-minute drive from the nearest town. It wasn't the first time I'd done something like this. I liked the quiet, the isolation, the chance to be alone with my thoughts and away from the constant noise of the city. I booked the place for 5 nights. A simple log cabin, no neighbors, no Wi-Fi, no cell service. Just me, a few books, and the sounds of the forest. The owner had left the keys under a rock near the door, just as he'd said he would in his email. The cabin itself was small, just one room with a bed in the corner, a wood-burning stove, a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom with a pump-operated sink and a compost toilet. No running water, no electricity except for a couple of dim solar-powered lights. It was exactly what I was looking for. I arrived in the late afternoon, parked my car near the cabin, and stepped out. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. The trees stretched high into the sky, their bare branches swaying gently in the wind. It was early spring, still cold at night but not unbearable. The only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. I unloaded my things, mostly food, a few basic supplies, and a thick sleeping bag for the chilly nights, then locked my car and stepped inside. The wooden floor creaked beneath my boots. The cabin smelled of old wood and stale air, like it hadn't been used in a while. I set my bags down, checked the place over, and started a fire in the stove to warm it up. That first night was peaceful. I sat by the fire, ate a simple meal, and read until my eyes grew heavy. The wind picked up outside, whispering through the trees, but inside, the fire crackled, casting soft shadows across the walls. When I finally turned in, I fell asleep almost instantly. The next morning, I woke up to silence. No birds, no wind, just a strange, heavy stillness that made me uneasy. I got up, stretched, and made some instant coffee with water I'd brought in jugs. I stepped outside to take a breath of fresh air, and that's when I noticed something strange. My car door was open, not just unlocked, but wide open, like someone had been inside. I froze. I was sure I had locked it the night before. I always did. Cautiously, I walked over and peeked inside. Nothing seemed out of place. My bags were still in the back seat, my keys were inside the cabin, and there were no signs that anything had been taken. I checked the ground around the car but didn't see any footprints other than my own from the day before. It was strange, but I told myself I must have forgotten to lock it. Maybe the wind had blown it open, though that didn't make much sense. Still, I pushed the thought aside and locked it again. I spent the day hiking around the woods, enjoying the solitude. The sun was out, and the quiet of the forest was calming. I found a small stream about a mile from the cabin, sat by the water for a while, and then headed back as the sky darkened. That night, I made another fire, ate dinner, and read for a while. The silence outside still felt unnatural, but I tried to ignore it. Then, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard something, a soft rustling sound. Not the wind, not an animal, something deliberate, came from just outside the cabin. I lay completely still, my heart pounding. I waited, listening. The sound came again, something moving near the wall outside, just beneath the window. I sat up slowly and reached for the flashlight next to my bed. The fire had died down, leaving the room in near total darkness. I turned on the flashlight and pointed it at the window, but all I could see was my own reflection in the glass. I listened for a while longer, but the sound never came again. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. I turned off the flashlight, pulled the sleeping bag tighter around me, and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and froze. There were footprints in the dirt. Not mine. They were fresh, leading from the trees to my cabin and stopping just beneath my window. I stared at them, my stomach tightening. They weren't from an animal. They were human. Someone had been standing there, watching me. My first instinct was to grab my things and leave. But my car was still there, untouched. I still had no cell service, no way to call for help, and the nearest town was miles away. I took a deep breath and forced myself to think. Whoever it was, they hadn't tried to break in. They hadn't taken anything. Maybe it was just a hiker who'd wandered too close by accident. That was the excuse I gave myself, at least. I spent the day feeling on edge, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. I kept my knife on me, my flashlight in my pocket. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That night, I kept the fire burning and stayed awake as long as I could. But eventually, exhaustion won and I dozed off. I woke up to the sound of my doorknob rattling. My blood turned to ice. Someone was trying to get in. I sat up, heart hammering in my chest. The door was locked, but the knob twisted again, more forcefully this time. I grabbed my flashlight, pointed it toward the door, and listened. The rattling stopped. Then came slow, deliberate footsteps, circling the cabin. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped outside the window. For what felt like an eternity, there was silence. Then, slowly, the footsteps retreated. I didn't move until the first light of dawn crept through the trees. I packed my things the second the sun was up. I didn't care that I had paid for 5 nights. I wasn't staying another second. I threw my bags into the car, locked the cabin behind me, and got in. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of there as fast as the dirt road would allow. As I drove past the trees, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, and that's when I saw him, a man, standing just at the edge of the woods, watching me go. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I just kept driving until I reached town, where I parked outside a gas station and sat there, shaking. I don't know who he was. I don't know what he wanted. But I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone in those woods. I don't know why I agreed to that trip in the first place. Maybe it was the idea of getting away for a while, shutting off my phone, and just being somewhere quiet. Maybe it was because I was tired of hearing how good for me it would be. Or maybe I just didn't want to seem like a coward. Either way, I should have listened to my gut. My cousin, Eric, had a cabin deep in the woods. Not one of those modern, fully stocked weekend getaway types. This was an old, worn-down hunting cabin his grandfather had built decades ago. No running water, no electricity, no cell service. Just a single wood stove, a pump well outside, and a pile of chopped firewood. He used it for hunting trips, but he wasn't much of a hunter. Mostly it just sat empty. Eric swore it was peaceful. No traffic, no noise, no people. Just trees and fresh air. That's what he told me when he invited me along for the weekend. "You'll love it." I didn't love it. The drive itself was almost 2 hours, half of it on paved roads, the other half on winding dirt paths that got narrower and rougher the further we went. By the time we reached the trailhead, where we had to leave the truck and hike the last mile in, my nerves were already starting to fray. The trees were dense, stretching tall in every direction. The forest floor was thick with undergrowth, and the further we walked, the quieter it got. At first, there was the occasional sound of a bird or a rustling branch, but after about 20 minutes, it felt like the whole forest was holding its breath. We reached the cabin just before sunset. It was smaller than I expected, just a single room with a slanted tin roof and a porch that looked like it could collapse at any second. The logs were dark with age, the windows small and shuttered, and the front door had deep scratches carved into it, like something had clawed at the wood years ago. Eric didn't seem to notice or care. He dropped his pack, unlocked the door, and pushed it open. Inside, it smelled like old wood, damp fabric, and something stale, like a place that had been left closed up for too long. There was a single bed frame with a thin, lumpy mattress pushed against the wall, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, and a shelf with some canned food and an old lantern. A rusted-out wood stove sat in the corner with a pile of ash still in it. Cozy, right? Eric grinned, but I just nodded, pretending I wasn't already regretting this trip. We got a fire going before dark. The temperature dropped fast, and by the time we ate, I could see my breath inside the cabin. Eric turned in early, and I stayed up for a while, sitting by the fire and listening. The woods were still. No wind, no insects, no movement. Then I heard something. It was faint at first, a distant, rhythmic crunching, like footsteps moving slowly through the undergrowth. At first, I thought maybe it was an animal, a deer or a coyote, but the sound didn't wander or pause like an animal would. It was steady, deliberate, getting closer. I held my breath. The sound stopped just beyond the tree line, maybe 30 feet from the cabin. I waited, listening. Nothing. After a while, I convinced myself it was my imagination, stirred the fire, and finally lay down on the mattress. Took a long time to fall asleep. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, barely lighting the room. The air was freezing. For a second, I didn't know what had woken me. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, not distant this time, not at the tree line. They were right outside the cabin. Slow, shuffling steps circling the walls. My body locked up. I lay completely still, barely breathing. The sound moved around the cabin, passing the front door, then the side wall, then stopping near the back. I strained my ears. Silence. Then, a light scraping sound just beneath the window. A slow, dragging movement against the wood, like something feeling along the outside of the cabin. I couldn't move. I just lay there, staring at the dark ceiling, heart hammering. Then it stopped. Minutes passed, maybe longer. I didn't dare move, waiting, listening. Nothing. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I must have fallen asleep. The next morning, Eric acted normal. He hadn't heard anything. I went outside and checked around the cabin, but there were no footprints, no marks, nothing to prove what I had heard. We spent the day hiking. I tried to shake the feeling, but the further we got from the cabin, the more I felt like something was watching us. Every time we stopped, every time we rested, the feeling was there. By the time we got back, the sun was starting to set. That's when I saw it. The front door. It was open. I knew we had locked it before leaving. Eric swore he had the only key. He tried to brush it off, saying maybe the wind pushed it open, but the lock was unlatched. I checked the cabin. Nothing was missing, but something felt wrong. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound set me on edge. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time. I forced myself to stay still, listening. The sound circled the cabin, slower this time, deliberate. Then, asterisk, a soft thud against the wall. Asterisk. My breath caught. It wasn't at the window this time. It was at the door. Another thud. Then the sound of something dragging across the wood. I clenched my teeth, gripping the blankets tight, every nerve in my body screaming. The doorknob rattled, slow at first, then harder. Then it stopped. Silence. I waited. Minutes passed. An hour. Maybe more. I didn't sleep. By morning, it was like nothing had happened. Eric still didn't believe me. I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there. We packed up fast, loading our gear, dousing the fire. I didn't even eat breakfast. Then I saw them. Footprints. Just beyond the tree line. Not boots. Not animal tracks. Bare feet. Leading from the woods. Circling the cabin. And disappearing back into the trees. We left. I didn't say a word the whole hike back to the truck. Eric never invited me back. I never asked to go. And I never... never want to know what would have happened if I had opened that door. I don't know what made me say yes to the trip in the first place. Maybe it was the need to get away, or maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I could handle being out there, alone in the woods, without cell service, without the hum of traffic in the distance. The thought of isolation had been appealing at first, almost comforting. But that was before I knew what it really felt like to be cut off from everything. I'd rented the cabin for 3 nights. It was a small place, tucked deep into the mountains, about an hour's drive from the nearest town. The online listing had described it as a cozy off-grid retreat, with breathtaking views and complete solitude. It had running water, a wood stove, and a generator for electricity, but no internet, no phone signal. A landline for emergencies, but that was it. The pictures made it look perfect, dark wood siding, a front porch with a pair of rocking chairs, a dense forest stretching out in every direction. It felt like the kind of place where no one would bother me. The road leading up to it was just a narrow dirt path, winding through the trees, barely wide enough for my car. The first thing I noticed when I got there was the silence. Not the peaceful kind either. The kind that makes you feel like you're being watched. I shook it off, convincing myself it was just the way my mind reacted to being alone in an unfamiliar place. I unpacked, bringing my bags inside and checking the place out. It was just one large room with a small kitchen, a bed, and a wood stove in the corner. A bathroom with a composting toilet. Simple but comfortable. The windows were large, letting in the last of the afternoon light, and I could see nothing but trees stretching out in every direction. I locked the door behind me, set my bag down, and lit the wood stove. That first night, I barely slept. It wasn't that I felt unsafe exactly, just unsettled. The wind outside was constant, pressing against the cabin in slow, heavy gusts. The trees creaked, branches tapping against the roof, and every now and then, I'd hear something moving out there. A rustling in the leaves, the snap of a twig, probably just deer, maybe a raccoon. I forced myself to ignore it, pulling the thick quilt over me and turning onto my side, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By the second day, I had mostly convinced myself I was being paranoid. The morning was cold, the sky overcast, but I felt better once I was up and moving. I spent the day hiking, following an old logging trail that led up the side of the mountain. The higher I climbed, the more I could see. The forest stretching out in waves of dark green, the distant peaks capped with snow. It was beautiful, but something felt off. I kept catching glimpses of movement between the trees. Too far to see clearly, just a flicker of motion in my peripheral vision. Every time I turned to look, there was nothing. No sound, no footprints. Just the trees swaying in the wind. By late afternoon, I'd had enough. I hiked back to the cabin, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my gut. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light. I had been alone too long, and my brain was making things up to fill the silence. But that night, I woke up to something much worse. It was the sound that did it. A slow, deliberate scraping against the outside of the cabin. I froze. The wood stove had burned down to just embers, leaving the room in near darkness. The only light came from the moon through the window, casting long, pale streaks across the floor. My breath felt too loud in my own ears, my heart slamming against my ribs. There it was again, a long, dragging sound, moving along the wall just outside. like something rough being scraped against the wood. I stayed perfectly still, listening. Then a thud. Something knocked against the door. Not the wind, not an animal. A knock. I didn't move. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. The cabin was miles from anyone. No one should be here. No one would be here. Another knock. Harder this time. I reached for my flashlight with a shaking hand and flicked it on, sweeping it toward the door. Nothing. I waited. Minutes passed, the silence stretching unbearably long. Then, just as I started to think I had imagined it, footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving around the cabin toward the window. I turned off the flashlight, sinking lower into the bed. My breathing was too loud, but I couldn't seem to control it. I felt it before I saw it. An overwhelming certainty that something was standing just outside the window, watching me. I didn't dare move. Seconds crawled by. Then the footsteps started again, this time moving away. I lay there for what felt like hours, every nerve in my body on edge, listening for any sound. But there was nothing. Finally, just as dawn started to creep through the trees, exhaustion took over. I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, it was morning. I barely hesitated. I threw my things into my bag, making sure I left nothing behind. I stepped outside, heart hammering as I scanned the ground around the cabin. Footprints, deep, clear boot prints in the dirt, circling the cabin. Not mine. I ran to my car, yanking the door open and throwing my bag inside. That's when I noticed something else. The lock on the front door. It was scratched, the metal gouged, like someone had been trying to force it open. I didn't stop to think. I got in the car, started the engine, and tore down that dirt road faster than I ever should have, the tires skidding in the loose gravel. I didn't stop until I was back in town, surrounded by people, my hands still shaking on the wheel. I don't know who was out there that night. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know this. If I had unlocked that door, if I had let my curiosity get the better of me, I might not be here to tell this story. And that cabin? I never looked back. I don't know why I thought renting a remote cabin in the middle of the woods was a good idea. Maybe I wanted some peace, maybe I wanted to get away from everything, or maybe I just didn't think things through. It wasn't supposed to be some horror movie scenario. Just a weekend alone, no distractions, no work, no people. Just me, some books, and the quiet. The cabin itself wasn't anything fancy. It was small, maybe 20 by 25 feet, just a single-room structure with a kitchen corner, a small fireplace, a bed pushed up against one wall, and a single bathroom. It was old but solid. Wooden walls, heavy door, thick glass windows, nothing modern but sturdy. I drove up late Friday afternoon, following a dirt road that wound through dense trees. The cabin sat in a small clearing, maybe 50 yards across, surrounded by towering pines and thick underbrush. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just isolation. That was the point. I parked my car beside the cabin, unloaded my bag, locked the car, and stepped inside. The place smelled like aged wood and dust, but it was clean enough. The silence was almost overwhelming at first, the kind of quiet you don't really notice until you're deep in it. No traffic, no voices, no hum of electricity, just wind through the trees and the occasional creak of wood settling. I spent the evening the way I planned, reading, eating, enjoying the solitude. The sun set behind the trees, and the cabin grew dark except for the soft glow of my lantern. I built a small fire in the fireplace, more for comfort than warmth, and eventually went to bed. It was sometime past midnight when I woke up. Not fully, not at first. Just enough to realize something had pulled me out of sleep. I lay still, listening. The fire had died down, and the cabin was almost pitch black except for a faint sliver of moonlight through the window. Then I heard it. Something moving outside. It wasn't the wind. The wind had a rhythm, a steady rustling through the trees. This was different. Slow, deliberate, heavy. Footsteps. At first, I tried to tell myself it was an animal. Maybe a deer, maybe a bear. But the longer I listened, the more certain I became. This wasn't the sound of hooves or paws. This was the weight of a person, boots pressing into the dirt, moving carefully around the cabin. I stayed in bed, barely breathing, heart pounding so hard I swore whoever was out there could hear it. I wanted to look, but I didn't want to move. If there was someone outside, they'd see any movement through the windows. The footsteps circled the cabin once, then stopped near the door. Silence. Long, stretching silence. I waited, counting the seconds. Nothing. Then, the doorknob rattled. A slow, deliberate test, like someone checking if it was locked. I froze. Whoever was out there wasn't just passing through. They were trying to get in. The door was locked. I made sure of that when I came in. But suddenly, it didn't feel strong enough. It wasn't a deadbolt, just an old-fashioned latch lock. If they really wanted to get in, they could. The rattling stopped. More silence. Then the footsteps moved again, this time toward the window. I held my breath, eyes locked on the faint outline of the glass. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel them standing there, watching. I don't know how long it lasted. Minutes, maybe longer. But eventually, the footsteps moved away. Slowly, carefully, back toward the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By the time the first light of morning crept through the trees, I was exhausted, but still alert. I stayed inside for another hour, waiting, listening. When I finally worked up the nerve to check outside, there were footprints in the dirt. Large, booted prints, circling the cabin, stopping at the door and window. Whoever it was, they hadn't run. They had walked, slow, patient. I wanted to leave, but I had no real reason. Nothing had actually happened. No one had broken in, no one had hurt me. Could have been a lost hiker. Could have been nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. Still, I forced myself to stay. It was probably just my imagination, I told myself. I was alone in the woods, my mind playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the unease. That night, I locked up early, made sure the fire was going, and tried to sleep. I didn't. Around midnight, it happened again. Footsteps. Slow. Careful. Moving around the cabin. I stayed still, listening, barely breathing. I had an old hunting knife in my bag, but what was I going to do with it? If someone really wanted to get in, a knife wasn't going to stop them. The footsteps circled the cabin once, twice, then stopped. Minutes passed. Then, a sound near the back wall. A soft scrape, like metal against wood. I gripped the knife, body tense. The sound stopped. More silence. Then, slowly, the footsteps moved away, back into the woods. I didn't move until morning. When I finally worked up the nerve to check the back wall, I saw it. A small mark just below the window. A thin, deliberate scratch in the wood, like someone had tested it. That was enough for me. I packed my bag, threw it in the car, and left. I didn't stop until I hit the main road, didn't check my phone until I had service again. When I finally did, I pulled up the listing for the cabin. No reviews, no history, just an address and a contact email. I never went back, and I never found out who was out there. I was looking forward to a weekend alone in the mountains. Work had been wearing me down, and the thought of spending 3 days in a rented cabin, surrounded by nothing but trees and fresh air, sounded perfect. I found the place online, a small old log cabin deep in the woods, a good 10 miles from the nearest town. The listing mentioned that it had no Wi-Fi, no TV, and barely any cell service. That was fine with me. I wanted to unplug. The drive up was long, most of it on a winding dirt road. My SUV kicked up dust as I passed miles of dense forest, the trees growing thicker the higher I climbed. I hadn't seen another car for nearly an hour when I finally spotted the cabin up ahead, tucked between tall pines. It was just like the pictures. Small, rustic, with a stone chimney and a wide porch overlooking a valley below. I parked next to the cabin and got out, stretching my legs. The air was crisp, colder than I expected for late summer. I grabbed my bag from the back seat and walked up to the door. The key was under a loose rock, just as the owner had said. Inside, The cabin smelled like old wood and dust. A stone fireplace took up most of one wall, with a stack of firewood beside it. The furniture was simple, just a couch, a wooden table, and a single rocking chair by the window. A small kitchenette was tucked in the corner, and a narrow hallway led to the bedroom and bathroom. I set my bag down and walked over to the window. The sun was already dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows across the porch. From here, I could see the trail leading down the hill, disappearing into the woods. There wasn't a single sound outside. No cars, no voices, not even birds. Just complete, heavy silence. That first night was peaceful. I made a simple dinner, read for a while, then went to bed early. The bed was old, the mattress thin, but I was exhausted. I fell asleep almost instantly. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night, disoriented. The room was pitch dark, but something had pulled me out of sleep. I lay there, heart pounding, listening. At first, I thought I had imagined it. Then I heard it again, a crunching sound, like footsteps on dried leaves. I sat up, my mind still foggy. The sound was coming from outside, somewhere near the porch. Slow, deliberate steps. Not an animal, too steady, too heavy. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, but when I clicked the screen, there was no service. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe a deer had wandered close. Maybe it was just the house settling. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was standing outside, just listening. After a few minutes, the footsteps stopped. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something else to happen. But the night was silent again. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped out onto the porch, squinting in the sunlight. Everything looked normal. The forest stretched out in every direction, undisturbed. But when I glanced down, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. Footprints. Not boot prints, bare feet. The prints were large, deep enough to suggest weight, and they led from the tree line right up to the porch. Whoever had been out here last night had stood just a few feet from my door before turning back into the woods. A chill ran through me. I wasn't the only person out here. I tried to push the thought away as I went about my day. I hiked a few trails, took some photos, tried to enjoy the quiet, but I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. That night, I locked the door and shut the curtains before climbing into bed. I didn't expect to sleep much, and I was right. Every little sound outside made my skin crawl. The wind rustling through the trees, the creak of the porch settling. I lay there, gripping the blanket, staring into the darkness. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. They were slower this time, more cautious, moving along the porch. I held my breath, barely daring to move. My heart was hammering so hard I was afraid whoever was outside would hear it. Then, a soft tap against the window. I nearly stopped breathing. Another tap, fingertips testing the glass. I stayed completely still. My mind was racing. What do I do? If I turned on a light, would it scare them off? Or would it let them know I was awake? Should I grab something for protection? My phone still had no service. Calling for help wasn't an option. The tapping stopped. Silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. Then, slowly, the footsteps moved away. I stayed awake until dawn, barely moving. When the sun finally came up, I forced myself to go outside. The footprints were there again, clear in the dirt. This time, they circled the cabin. Whoever it was had been walking around my home all night, watching. I didn't stay for the third night. I packed up and got in my car, heart racing the whole time. As I backed out of the driveway, I caught one last glimpse of the cabin in my rearview mirror. And then I saw him, a man, standing just at the edge of the trees, half hidden in the shadows. He was tall, his skin pale, his hair wild and unkempt. He was barefoot, and he was watching me leave. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I drove straight back to town, only relaxing once I saw other cars on the road. When I returned the key, I told the cabin owner about the footprints. He frowned, scratching his head. "You sure? That place is pretty isolated. Nobody ever goes up there." I didn't argue. I just nodded, got in my car, and left. I never went back. A week later, curiosity got the better of me. I searched online for anything about that area, and I found something. 15 years ago, a man had been living in those woods. A recluse, people said. He never spoke to anyone, just wandered through the forest. One day, a hiker went missing near the cabin. They searched for weeks but never found him. The old man was questioned but never arrested. Eventually, he disappeared, vanishing into the wilderness. No one had seen him since, until now. Here's a first-person, highly detailed, realistic scary cabin story. I've made it long and immersive, focusing on real-world fear and danger, with no supernatural elements. #, deep in the woods. I never liked the idea of staying in an isolated cabin, but I let my friend convince me. He owned a small place deep in the woods, about 3 hours from the nearest town. It was old but sturdy, built by his grandfather decades ago. No running water, no electricity, just a wood stove, an outhouse, and an old gas-powered generator that barely worked. It sat at the edge of a lake, surrounded by nothing but trees for miles. He swore it was peaceful. Good for the soul, he told me. I wasn't so sure. He had work and couldn't come with me, but he insisted I go alone. Just relax for a few days, he said. Clear your head. He gave me a map and the key, told me where to find the firewood, the water pump, and the shotgun his grandfather kept under the bed. You probably won't need it, he said with a grin, but it's there. The drive was long, the roads turning from pavement to gravel, then to dirt. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was dipping low. The place looked exactly like I expected. Dark wood, a small front porch, a sagging roof. The lake behind it was still, black water reflecting the trees like a mirror. I stepped inside, and dust floated in the air. The place smelled like old wood and something damp. The generator coughed when I started it, but the lights flickered on. I checked the corners, opened the cabinets, tested the locks on the door and windows. Everything seemed fine. The first night was uneventful. I made a fire in the wood stove, heated up some canned soup, and read by flashlight. The silence was thick. I could hear every creak of the cabin, every rustling leaf outside. Around midnight, I stepped onto the porch. The air was cold, the stars sharp and bright. The lake was perfectly still. It felt like the world had shrunk down to just me, the trees, and the water. I slept lightly, waking up at every little noise. It was just the wind, I told myself. Just the trees settling. Day 2. The morning was cold. I brewed coffee on the propane stove and stepped outside. The forest smelled fresh, damp with dew. I decided to hike a bit, following a narrow trail that led away from the cabin. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No birds, no wind, just my own footsteps crunching on dead leaves. I found an old hunting stand about a mile in. It was falling apart, wooden slats covered in moss. Nearby, I spotted something strange. A pile of bones. Not fresh, but not fully bleached either. Probably a deer, though I didn't see a skull. Something about it made me uneasy. I turned back. That afternoon, I went down to the lake. The water was ice cold. I walked along the shore, kicking rocks, watching the ripples spread. That's when I noticed the footprints. They weren't mine. They were old, edges softened by the wind, but they led from the trees down to the water and back again. Barefoot, the size of an adult's. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. Maybe a hiker had passed through. Maybe someone had gone for a swim, but it felt wrong. That night, I locked the door and kept the shotgun next to my bed. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. Not the wind, something heavier. I stayed still, listening. Leaves crunching. A slow, deliberate sound, close to the cabin. Then a thud, wood against wood. The porch. I grabbed the shotgun and slid out of bed. My heart was pounding. I moved quietly to the window and peered out. Nothing. The trees stood dark and motionless. The lake was black glass. I waited, holding my breath. Nothing. Maybe a raccoon. Maybe the wind knocking something loose. I forced myself to lie back down, but I didn't sleep. I found the footprints in the morning, fresh. They started at the edge of the trees, leading right up to the cabin. And then they stopped. No return tracks, just gone. I felt something cold creep up my spine. Someone had been here, watching. I packed my things. I wasn't staying another night, but as I loaded my bag into the truck, I heard it again. Movement in the trees. I turned fast, shotgun raised. Nothing. The silence was suffocating. I climbed into the truck and locked the doors. The engine roared to life and I threw it into gear. Gravel kicked up as I sped down the dirt road. I kept glancing in the mirror, expecting to see something. Nothing. The cabin disappeared behind the trees. But a mile down the road, something caught my eye. A figure standing just off the path. Too far to see clearly, but close enough. Watching. I didn't slow down. I didn't look back. I drove straight through the night all the way home. I never went back.